Well, brethren, we are here on the final day of the days of unleavened bread. And this final day has a particular significance in the plan and purpose of God. This entire festival does. We have noticed some aspects of that you did on the first holy day, and certainly today in the sermon and the sermonettes. But I want to focus on perhaps a little different aspect of this festival, and also particularly of this day that we are here upon. Because God tells us that this seventh day, this final day of the 7 days of unleavened bread, is a holy convocation, and there are some important things that we learn from the significance of this day itself. Now let's start out, let's go back to the book of Romans, chapter 8, and we will introduce the subject. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes that there is a particular book in the Bible that has very special significance to this particular day. And the reason we're here today, there's a particular book in the Bible that focuses in on an account that is of special significance today, and one that we want to take note of later on in the sermon. In Romans chapter 8, the Apostle Paul writes in verse 1, "There is therefore now no condemnation to them which are in Christ Jesus, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit." To be in Christ Jesus has to do with the way of life we're practicing, the way that we're traveling through life. Are we walking after the flesh, or are we walking after the Spirit? What is the determining, governing, ruling factor in our lives? Because that ties in very directly with this day. No condemnation to those who are in Christ, who walk. Those who are in Christ are not walking after the flesh, they're walking after the Spirit, because they've repented, they've turned away from the ways of this world and the ways of the flesh. They don't want to be defined by the lusts and the pulls and the desires of this physical body. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. The law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has made me free from the law of sin and death. What the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God sending His own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and for sin, condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, who walk not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. The righteousness of the law being fulfilled in us. Now what the law could not do, the law, the purpose of the law is to define sin. The Apostle Paul, elsewhere in the book of Romans, said, "I wouldn't have known that I should not lust, except the law said, 'Thou shalt not covet.'" Now, which law says, "Thou shalt not covet"? Well, that's straight out of the Ten Commandments. Paul said, "I wouldn't know right from wrong. How would I know that I should not lust, except the law defines that as sin and says I shouldn't do it?" So the purpose of the law is to define sin. The law in and of itself cannot transform us. It simply defines for us what's right and what's wrong. Jesus Christ came in the likeness of sinful flesh. Jesus Christ came as a human being. He emptied Himself and took upon Himself the form of a servant. He came as a human being of the seed of Abraham. And He condemned sin in the flesh. He conquered sin in the flesh. He was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin, the book of Hebrews tells us. The righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us, because if Jesus Christ is living His life in us, He is living the same kind of life He led almost 2,000 years ago. And so, if we're walking in the Spirit, the righteousness of the law is being fulfilled in us if we're walking in the way that the Spirit of God is leading us. "For they that are after the flesh do mind the things of the flesh. They that are after the Spirit, the things of the Spirit." So, what's defining our priority? What's important to us? To be carnally minded, physically minded, is death. To be spiritually minded is life and peace. So it gets back to what is ruling our mind, our attitude. The carnal mind is enmity against God. It's not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. So then they that are in the flesh cannot please God. If we're going to follow the ways of the flesh and the lust of the flesh, we can't please God following that way. But you're not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if so be that the Spirit of God dwell in you. Now, if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he's none of his. And if Christ be in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the Spirit is life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of Him that raised up Jesus from the dead dwell in you, He that raised up Christ from the dead shall also quicken your mortal body by that Spirit that dwells in you. Therefore, brethren, we're debtors not to the flesh to live after the flesh. If you live after the flesh, you'll die. But if through the Spirit you do mortify the deeds of the body, you will live. As many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. So we're to be led by the Spirit of God. Through the Spirit, we are to mortify, to put to death the deeds of the body. So the Spirit of God is given to us to enable us to triumph over sin, to conquer, to overcome. We are not to be carnally minded, to be governed by the pulls and the desires of the flesh, by what comes naturally. But rather, we're to be governed, to be ruled by the Spirit of God. You know, if you look at it, most people are primarily governed by three things. One of two. In combination. We're all a little different personalities and temperaments. But some people, by their nature, are very calculating, very analytical. They analyze everything. One prime example of that found back in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 12. You read of the story of the division of the kingdom after the death of King Solomon. And you read of Jeroboam, who became the leader, selected as the leader of the 10 tribes. Now Jeroboam had been told, when King Solomon was still alive, one of God's prophets had told Jeroboam, Jeroboam was coming out of Jerusalem on an errand. The prophet came up and met him and said, "Here, let me see your new coat." And he took Jeroboam's new coat and he proceeded to rip it into 12 pieces. And he handed him back 10 of them. I don't know about you, but that would have gotten my attention. Somebody grabs my new coat and starts ripping it into, a bunch of pieces. I'd be paying attention. And he handed Jeroboam back 10 of them. He says, "You know what this means?" Jeroboam must have shaken his head. No, all I know is he tore up my coat. What does this mean? And the prophet said, God is going, when Solomon dies. Now, I'm going to do it in Solomon's lifetime because he made a promise today. But when Solomon dies, God is going to take the kingdom. And He's going to give you 10 tribes. And you'll rule over 10 tribes. Now, He's going to allow the 2 tribes to be governed by Solomon's son from Jerusalem. Because He made a promise today. But He's going to make you king. He's going to give you 10 tribes. And if, biggest little 2-letter word in the English language is, if you walk in my ways as David did, then I will build you a house. This is what the prophet told to Jeroboam. Well, word of this must have trickled back to Solomon. So Solomon all of a sudden got upset, and Jeroboam had to flee. Get out down in Egypt for a few years until Solomon died. He came back. He was made king. They had the coronation. A little time passed over. And then when you read the account in 1 Kings 12, Jeroboam is analyzed. Now, he was an analytical sort of fellow that sort of calculated and figured, and the actions he took were not emotional, impulsive, just sort of jump up and do something. No, Jeroboam was a fellow who thought about things, and he analyzed. And what he analyzed was, he said, it's just a matter of time. The people are going to be going to Jerusalem every year for the Passover. They're going to come up there, and there's going to be, they're going to be so glad to get back together. You see, he was an intelligent enough man to know that the new wears off. You know, when they had the split in the kingdom, boy, people were all stirred up and they were mad and they'd been upset because of the taxes. They're not going to put up with any more of this stuff, and they had a new man in and he was going to be new king, and they were all excited. But that happens, you know. You have an election, new guy gets elected. He's real popular for a little while. Jeroboam was smart enough to know he sees no why. It's just a matter of time until they find something to be upset with me about. And in the meantime, they're going to be going up to Jerusalem every year. That old Rehoboam, he'll be there to greet them, you know, and they'll sort of have the welcoming night ceremonies. And a few years go by, and they're going to begin hankering and wishing they could all be back together. The next thing you know, they're going to look at me and say, this guy's a problem. We'll get rid of him, and then we'll all be one kingdom in Jerusalem. Now, you know, from a carnal standpoint, that makes sense. Jeroboam wanted to protect himself. So he thought about it. He said, call people together, and he said, you know what? It's really too far for you folks to have to go to Jerusalem every year for the feast. We've been thinking about it, and you know what we're going to do? We're going to have two feasts up here. We're going to have one way up north in Dan, and another one down south in Bethel. You can just go to the church in your thoughts. You can go to either one, doesn't matter. And we're going to set up a couple of golden calves, one at each place. You remember the golden calf? Why, that's what Aaron made. That's what led us out of Egypt. It's amazing. You know, you can rewrite history and people sort of think, I didn't remember it quite that way, but I did hear something about the golden calf. Maybe that's right. So he says, we're going to set up a golden calf here and there. And he said, you know, the feast is really sort of inconvenient to have it in the 7th month. You've got to hurry up and get all that harvest in. We're just going to bump that back and have it in. That'll be a little more convenient. It'll be just like the one that they have down in Jerusalem. So, Jeroboam appointed a new priesthood, people that would preach what he paid them to preach. Preach the lowest of the people, chased the Levites out. Changed the date of the feast, set up the high places in Dan and Bethel, the golden calf. Why did he do it? He did it because he was trying to protect himself and ensure the permanence of his own. That's why I'm trying to do it. And if you look at it logically, it makes sense, except for one fact. You see, here's the problem with human reason and logic and analytical approach. It left God out of the picture. He did all his calculations and it made sense, except he left God out of the picture. Now, Jeroboam was a man who was led by his intellect, and he calculated and analyzed, and that was the ruling factor in his life, but you know things didn't turn out well. What he tried to protect, he lost. His dynasty ended very quickly after his death. If we're governed by human reason, if we're governed by our intellect, analyzing things, and if that's what controls our life, it's limited. Now, many people, in fact, probably more people than are governed by their intellect, are governed by their impulses and their emotions. You remember the account there in the Gospels? Jesus and the disciples were coming from Galilee to Jerusalem and had to come through Samaria on the way down. And they entered into this little village there of Samaria, one of the Samaritan villages, trying to buy some food. And the folks there realized they were on their way to Jerusalem for the feast, and they said, we're not selling you anything. We don't want your kind here. You're going to Jerusalem. We don't want you around. Oh boy, you talk about being mad. The disciples were upset. You know, remember James and John, they looked over at Jesus and they said, Lord, you want us to just call down fire from heaven? Let's just burn them up. We'll just nuke the place. Just make a sort of a smoldering black crater here. We'll teach them. They can't do us that way. You know, Jesus had a very simple solution. He said, let's just go on to the next village. You know, he told them, you don't know what spirit you're of. See, James and John, in fact, Jesus had a nickname for James and John. Remember what it was? He called them the sons of thunder. They were always rumbling and flashing, you know. The lightning flashes, the thunder rolls. You maybe know a few folks like James and John. Maybe you can even identify with James and John. Jesus had a nickname for them. He called them old, sons of thunder. They were always stirred up about something. They were impulsive and they were emotional, and boy, they weren't going to put up with that. Their temper flared up. They were ready to just miss the place. I said, you don't know what spirit you're on. I didn't come to do that sort of thing. Let's just go on to the next village. Pretty simple. You read the accounts through the Bible and you read of different people who had to struggle with their emotions governing them. Peter was one. Peter was an impulsive sort of fellow. And he was quick to flare up, quick to say what he was going to do and wasn't going to do. And he was he could be a pretty, a pretty emotional sort of fellow. King David was very much that way. And he had to struggle with that. Following his impulses, following his emotions is what got him in trouble with baptism. Up on the roof of the palace, looked over there on the roof of her house, and the impulse of the moment was what he acted on. There are many people who are very emotional, very impulsive, and the feelings that come into their mind, and it can be anger, it can be lust, it can be whatever. They just, were stirred up, and they ready to respond on the moment. Now, of course, time passes by, and what seemed like a good idea at the moment doesn't necessarily seem like a real good idea after the emotions have cooled off. So, some people are governed and controlled by their intellect, and they're always calculating, analyzing the angles. Other people are just emotional and impulsive, and they just sort of do on the spur of the moment whatever pops into their mind, whatever pops out their mouth, which pops into their mind, which presents some sense problems, right? Now there are others. There's a story back in Kings and Chronicles about a king by the name of Joash. Joash was a little boy whose life was spared. The queen mother actually tried to wipe out the whole royal family. Nice place. She was a chip off the old block. She was Jezebel's daughter, and Athaliah was her name. She tried to wipe out the royal family to make herself queen. There was her little infant grandson, Joash, was hidden by the high priest. And then, when he was 7 years old, he was crowned king. And this elderly priest, who lived to be well over 100 years of age, this elderly priest guided Joash and helped him. And we're told a very interesting thing. That Joash served the Lord all the days of Jehoiada's reign. But then this elderly priest died. And the next thing you find is that some of the young men came to Joash, and they were sort of his buddies, and they wanted to go over here and do this and go over there and do that, and the next thing you know, Joash has left serving God, and he's running with his crowd. You see, Joash, there's the third category. Some are governed by their emotions, some are governed by intellect and reason. The third category of people are basically, they go with the crowd. They are influenced by who they're with, depending on who the crowd is. If they're in a good crowd, they do pretty good. If they're in a bad crowd, they do pretty bad. They want to please people. Now, most people are led by one of those three things, or a combination, because none of us are just totally 100% intellect or emotion or, let's say, social creatures. We are all three. We have a mind, we have emotions, and we are influenced by other people. But most people tend to fall into one of those three categories and to be primarily either going with the crowd, acting on their own impulses and emotions, or very sort of analytical and calculating. Now, the trouble with all three of those is that there is a way that seems right unto a man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. Your intellect is not going to lead you in the way of faith. Your emotions are not going to be an infallible guide to obeying God and pleasing Him. Following the crowd certainly isn't going to be. You see, the Scripture tells us that if you through the Spirit, this is Romans 8:13, if you through the Spirit do mortify the deeds of the body, you will live. As many as are led by the Spirit of God, they're the sons of God. As many as are led by the Spirit of God. That's what you and I must be led by if we are to live a life that is pleasing to Him. Not controlled by our emotions. We all have emotions. Not controlled by just our mind and intellectually analyzing things. God's given us a mind. We ought to use it. Not just controlled by what other people think and what they're doing. Yes, that's fine to think about that and consider others. But fundamentally, the Scripture tells us we are to be led by the Spirit of God. The Spirit of God will lead us to the path of life. Now, if we follow the Spirit of God, that means we're going to be going contrary to the way that seems right unto a man. We're going to be going contrary to many times things that we feel emotionally, things that make sense logically. Jeroboam's reasoning made sense logically. But you see, if you have a choice between what God says and what you think, you better take what God says every time. Because God's right. He's right. And even though you and I can't necessarily calculate it out, and I might just mention there's a difference between hope and faith. I'm sort of reminded of a fellow years ago that his wife called me up. This is quite a number of years ago. His wife called me up one day and she said, wanted to borrow some money from the emergency fund. And I talked with her a little bit, and I said, well, what seems to be the problem? Well, they needed it right away. They needed to get it by this afternoon. And I said, well, what in the world happened? What's the problem? Well, it took a while. We sort of worked through the story, but finally the story came out. Well, her husband had written a bunch of hot checks. And they were, said they were going to come over and get him that afternoon if he didn't pay them off. And I said to her, I said, well, now, wait a minute. I said, how is it that y'all wrote all those hot checks? Didn't you know that you didn't have the money in the bank? Did you think you had the money? Well, no, we knew it wasn't there right then. I said, well, why would you write all those checks? Well, she thought about it for a little bit, and she says, well, we wrote those checks in faith. And I said, that wasn't faith. That was hope. That was not faith. That was hope. I think I need to come over and explain to y'all the difference between faith and hope. You see, faith is anchored on the promises of God. It's not just a matter of sort of writing a check and hoping that the money shows up. That's not faith. God didn't make that promise. God does say He'll take care of us, but He didn't say He would take care of us that way by making numbers miraculously appear in your bank account. But we're to follow the way of the Spirit, the way of faith. Now, let's go on a little further. Let's go back to the book of Revelation. And let's notice a common theme that runs through the messages of each one of the seven churches. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 1 starts out with the angel of the church of Ephesus. It goes through the various things. And notice down in verse 7. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. So there's something here for all of us. To him that overcomes will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. Then, verse 8, the angel of the church of Smyrna. Right. And he goes through the various things that they're told. And then in verse 17, he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. To him that overcomes will I give to eat of the hidden manna. See, well, actually, I had skipped over that. Pergamos is addressed in verse 12, Smyrna up in verse 8, but it tells the same thing to Smyrna, verse 11, chapter 2, verse 11. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He that overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Pergamos is addressed in verse 12, and they're also told in verse 17, to him that overcomes will I give to eat of the hidden manna. The Thyatira church is addressed in verse 18. And on down in verse 29. He that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Verse 26. He that overcomes and keeps my works unto the end, To him will I give power over the nations. Sardis is addressed in chapter 3 and verse 1. And again, they're told in verse 5, he that overcomes, the same shall be clothed in white raiment. The church of Philadelphia is addressed in verse 7. And again in verse 12, him that overcomes will I make a pillar in the temple of my God. The church of the Laodiceans is addressed in verse 14. And verse 21 says, to him that overcomes will I grant to sit with me in my throne, even as I also overcame and am sat down with my Father in his throne. To each one of the 7 churches, there is one part of the message that is the same to everyone, to all of God's people at all times. One common theme that runs through Revelation 2 and 3, the message to each of the churches. To him that overcomes. To him that conquers. That's what the word literally means. To him that conquers will I grant to sit in my throne, even as I also conquered. Jesus Christ came and overcame sin in the flesh. He overcame the world. He conquered. We're told that we are to be conquered. We are to be conquered. We saw in Romans chapter 8 that what this involves is that we are to be following the Spirit rather than the pulls of the flesh. Not relying on human intellect or human emotion and impulse, not relying on simply the pressures, social pressures of other people. But rather, we are to follow the Spirit of God. And the Spirit of God, which will lead us in the paths of righteousness. You see, sometimes God's law tells us to do something that on a human level doesn't make sense. Tithing doesn't make sense just on a purely human level. I mean, if you want to sit down and take a pencil and paper, you're not going to figure out as to why you will come out with more if you give God the tithe than if you don't. It doesn't, looking at it, just if you're going to analyze it, you look out and say, well, I'm running tight now, and if I give away any, well, boy, I'll really be in bad shape. I don't guess I can afford to tithe. Well, of course, faith says, well, no, you can't afford not to tithe, because God says that if you rob me, you're going to be cursed with a curse. So, we follow the lead of God's Spirit. We follow God's instructions, even though it may contradict. Jeroboam should have looked and said, I know it seems like that if I obey God and we all go down to Jerusalem, that is going to somehow bring us back under the influence of Rehoboam and I'll lose the kingdom. But I know that if I please God, God will bless me. See, that's what faith is. Intellect said, I don't see how it'll work that way. I think maybe I better do it the other way. I better protect myself. So the way we calculate and the way we feel and what other people say can't be determined ruling factors in our life, or we will be overcome by the world rather than overcome the world. As many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are His sons. Now, there is a book in the Bible that has as its entire theme the theme of conquest, the theme of victory. And much of the message of this book has to do with this festival season. Because in reality, one of the things we are celebrating this festival season and this day in particular is that we are here to celebrate victory. We're here to celebrate conquest. Jesus Christ conquered, and He said if we surrender unconditionally to Him, He will live in us and through us will conquer. He will provide and empower us with the help we need to conquer. We can be led by His Spirit rather than led by the flesh. Now, the Apostle Paul in the book of Hebrews tells us in verse 1, "Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into His rest," God's rest, "any of you should soon become shortened. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard." It's not enough to know the truth, you have to believe the truth. Believe it to the point that you act on it, that it changes your life. Paul says, the gospel was preached unto us, but it was preached unto ancient Israel. They heard the truth. They heard the very voice of God thundering from Mount Sinai. They heard God's revelation delivered directly through Moses. Verse 3, "For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, as I've sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest," although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. Now he's quoting from back in Psalm 95:11, where it talks about entering into God's rest. He spoke in a certain place of the seventh day on this one, and God did rest the seventh day from all His work. And in this place again, speaking of Psalm 95, "If they shall enter into my rest." Now God rested on the Sabbath day, and by resting on the Sabbath day, He sanctified it, set it apart, made it holy. We're told to remember that day and keep it holy. God made it. So the Sabbath and the rest on the Sabbath is a type of something that goes beyond that. "Seeing therefore that it remains that some should enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not because of unbelief." Again, he limits a certain day, saying in David, speaking here, quoting Psalm 95, this is verse 7, "Today, after so long a time," as he said, "today, if you'll hear His voice, harden not your hearts. For if Joshua," that's who he's talking about, Joshua of old, "if Joshua had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day." See, if Joshua led the children of Israel into rest, back in the book of Deuteronomy, this whole place here in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 1, "These are the statutes and judgments which you shall observe to do in the land which the Lord God of your fathers gives you to possess all the days you live upon the earth." Coming on down in verse 10, when you go over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God gives you to inherit, and when He gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety, then there will be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause His name to dwell there." When you go into the land to inherit, when you have conquered the land, and you enter into rest. But you see, the rest into which Joshua led was not the ultimate of which God was talking, because Paul is writing here in Hebrews 4:8, and he said if Joshua had given them rest, then God wouldn't afterward, 400 years afterward, or 350 years afterward, through David, have spoken of a yet future time, "if you will enter into my rest." So, he that is entered into His rest, verse 10, or verse 9 says, "There remains therefore a rest." Now, I just might call your attention, the word rest here in verse 9 is a totally different Greek word than the word rest everywhere else in Hebrews 4. Everywhere else in Hebrews 4, the word rest is translated from the Greek word kataposos, which means rest, or repose. But the word in verse 9, "There remains therefore a rest," there remains therefore a sabbatismos. Sabbatismos is the word that's used here. You don't have to be a great Greek scholar to be able to figure out sabbatismos. That sort of sounds like Sabbath. That's right. It means a Sabbath keeping. "There remains therefore a Sabbath keeping to the people of God, for he that is entered into his rest," God's rest, "he is also ceased from his own work, as God did from His." Now, how did God cease from His work? He rested on the seventh day. He sanctified. If we're entering into God's rest, of which the Sabbath is a type, then we're ceasing from our work. We're also resting on the Sabbath. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. That is a picture of something, and we're reminded of it every week, entering into God's rest. Now, who was it that led them into rest of hope? Joshua. Most of your English translations in verse 8 use the term Jesus. Now there's a reason for that. Jesus is let's say, the English spelling and pronunciation of the Greek term, of the Greek word, which is the equivalent of the Hebrew word Joshua. Joshua, in Hebrew, would be pronounced more like Yeshua, or something of that sort. Means literally the eternal Savior. The eternal Savior. He's our Savior. Well, languages, when you go from one language to the next, you use words that spell differently, names are different. If you know other languages, you know that that's often, often the case. King of Spain, Juan Carlos. If he were an English king, his name would be John Charles. And that's what the name means. It's one Spanish, and the other is the English. An example, Peter's name. Christ and the disciples normally spoke Aramaic, and Christ's name is Cephas. And that term is used, mentioned several times. That was an Aramaic word that meant rock. But you see, the Greeks didn't speak Aramaic, and most of the New Testament was written in the Greek language to people who spoke Greek. And so we find that the name is changed, and in one or two places it's mentioned. Cephas, which is by interpretation Peter, because Peter is the Greek word, comes from the Greek word petros, which means rock. Actually, Peter is our English way of spelling. You see, the significant thing about a name is the meaning of the name. The meaning is conveyed. But anyway, Jesus is the Greek form of Joshua is the Hebrew form. And so that's why you find in the New Testament, by the way, the names of many Old Testament characters spelled in an unusual way, like Elias instead of Elijah. It's just the nature of the language, the different forms in terms of ending of the language. But anyway, Joshua of old led the children of Israel into a conquest of the Promised Land and into rest. But what he gave them wasn't permanent, and it wasn't the ultimate. You see, Joshua of old was a type. He was, in reality, a type of Jesus Christ. He had the name Joshua, which meant the eternal Savior. He led Israel, he led God's people to conquer, and he led them into rest. But that wasn't the ultimate. That was merely a type. Now, I want us to turn back to the book of Joshua, and I want us to notice a little bit about the story. Because the book of Joshua is a story of conquest, of overcoming. And I want to call our attention specifically to 7 lessons that we will learn as we briefly look at an overview of the book of Joshua. These are 7 vital lessons having to do with conquest, with overcoming. The children of Israel were conquerors. They were overcomers in a physical sense, led by Joshua. We are to be conquerors, overcomers in a spiritual sense, led by the one of whom Joshua is the type, led by Jesus Christ, our living high priest. Now, notice here, I'm going to be going through this in the Jewish translation. It'll be very similar probably to the New King James or others that you notice the wording is slightly different. I'm using a little different translation. Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. It came to pass after the death of Moses, the servant of the Eternal, that the Eternal spoke unto Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, unto the land which I will give to you, or give to them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, to you have I given it, as I spoke unto Moses. So here is the land. God said, I am giving it to you. I am going to give you the victory over all of these nations, all of these obstacles that lie before you. I want you to enter into rest. I want you to inherit what I have for you. He went on to say in verse 5, "There shall not any man be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so will I be with you. I will not fail you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land which I swore unto their fathers to give. Only be strong and very courageous to observe to do according to all the law." Now here's our first point. The first thing God has told Joshua, He said, "Be strong and of a good courage." In order to overcome, in order to conquer, strength and courage is vital. You and I cannot go forward in life, either in a physical sense or a spiritual sense. We cannot go forward successfully without strength and courage. Strength has to do with the power to win, and courage has to do with the will, the heart to win. You know, you look at, and take both, by the way. You know, you look back at the Korean War or the Vietnamese War. The United States had the strength to win. We had massive armaments, we had nuclear weapons, we had all sorts. We had the strength to have conquered anywhere we wanted to conquer. But we did not have the courage and the will to use that strength. You know, sometimes you can see a ball game, and you see a team that has the talent, they have the ability, but somehow they don't have a will to win. And even though they have more innate talent and ability, they have strength. They lack courage. They lack heart. You see others that may have less ability and less strength, but they have a heart. They have the heart of a champion. You see, it takes strength and courage. If you have the will to win, but you lack the strength, or if you have the strength to win and lack the courage and the will, either way, you're in trouble. Joshua was told, "I want you to go forward. I'm going to give you the victory." You see, God is the author of our victory. In fact, as we're going to see, Jesus Christ is the author and the finisher of our faith. One of the reasons there is a holy day at the beginning, on the first day of the days of unleavened bread. There's one on the seventh day of the days of unleavened bread, because the whole days of unleavened bread is a time that focuses in on our conquest, our victory. And Jesus Christ is the author and the finisher. He is the one who makes possible the victory. He doesn't just start us out and says, "Hope you make it." Be strong and of a good courage, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land. Strong and of good courage. Now, what does that involve? Well, the strength and courage to obey God, to observe, to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you went. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you shall meditate therein day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written therein, that you may make your ways prosperous. Then you shall have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Be not affrighted, neither be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you whithersoever you go. If you step out to obey God, you step out in faith and in confidence to obey God, to do what God says, be strong and keep firm. The starting point of the life of an overcomer, of living the life of an overcomer, of living the life of a conqueror, spiritually. And God has called us to be spiritual conquerors, to be spiritual overcomers. We have the influences of the world around us. We have the enticements of what we see and what we feel, watching the eyes, watching the flesh, pride of life. These are things that we must overcome. The lust of the eyes. You know what we see, that attracts us and it entices us. Somehow the world looks so exciting. It looks like what we want. You remember when Satan was going to tempt Christ? And we're told that he took him up into a high mountain. And in a moment of time, He showed him all the kingdoms of this world. And He said, these are given unto me. They're delivered unto me, and I can give them to whomsoever I will. Bow down and worship me, and I'll give it all to you. He took him up and He showed him in a moment of time the kingdoms of all their kingdoms. He appealed for the life of God. Look at that. Look at that wealth. Look at that glamour. Look at that glory. Look at that power. Look at all of those things. It can be yours. Look at the wealth. Look at all of those. It's mine and I'll give it to you. So, if we're to be spiritual overcomers, spiritual conquerors, which is what we've been called to, we've got to have the strength and the courage to obey God. Now let's go on a little further. In Joshua chapter 2, we read the story of how two spies were sent in to view the land and to view Jericho. Jericho was the great citadel city of the Canaanites, and it was near the Jordan River, and if they were going to cross the Jordan River, the main road that led into the Promised Land led by Jericho. It was a great fortress city, and they were going to have to deal with Jericho before they went any further. So Joshua sent two spies. They went into the land, came to Jericho, sort of spied things out. If you remember the story, they came there and were lodged by Rahab. And Rahab hid the spies. In fact, Rahab told the spies in Joshua 2:9, she said, I know that the Eternal has given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. We've heard how the Eternal dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan, Sihon and Og. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any more spirit in any man because of you. For the Eternal, your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. So Rahab believed God. She believed what she saw. She helped the spies, and she asked them to remember her and her family, which they promised to do. Now, they came back and reported to Joshua. In chapter 3, Joshua rose up early in the morning, and they removed from Shittim and came to Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and they lodged there before they passed over. And then Joshua told them in verse 5, sanctify yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And he told the priests to take the Ark of the Covenant, and what they were to do, bearing the Ark on their shoulders, they were to go first, and they were to come down to the banks of the Jordan River. And when they got down to the banks of the Jordan River, Joshua said, when your feet step into the water will stop. Now, the water of the Jordan is flowing. If the water stops, what happens? Well, everything else drains away. The bottom of the Jordan was rocky. It was filled with gravel and rocks. And so when the water drained away, well, then they were able to walk across on that gravel bottom. So Joshua said, all you need to do is take the ark and walk down to the bank. And when you get there and your feet hit the water will stop. They had to step out on faith. They did. And so they came down. He told the people, now you wait, and you let the water drain off. Well, they came in, and the water stopped, and so they start wading out, you see, and the water stops, and what's down below very quickly drains away. The water stops like an invisible hand just up above you. Now, you're walking out in the middle of all this. You look up there, and here's this mound of water, and the mound of water is getting higher and higher and higher. Because the water keeps coming down from the north, but for some reason it doesn't go any further. Joshua says, I want you to get out in the middle of the river with the ark, and you just stand there. Oh, you just stand there and told all the people, now you cross the river. Look, the water is disappearing on down to the south, and so sure enough, they came on across. And then finally, he saved 12 men back, and he said, now you 12, each one of you get a bigger rock than you carry. And you go in front of the Levites, and you come up on the other side of the river and take these rocks where I'll show you. So they did, and finally, after everybody else was out, he told the Levites to, okay, bring the ark, come on up. So they walked on up out of the river, and as soon as they got on the bank, all of a sudden that invisible hand came down and the water's just whoosh. Imagine what an impressive sight that was, and realize you just lost it. Here comes this water pouring in. We're told here that this was a flood stage. This was not like, during the dry season of the year when it was just sort of a little trickle, you just sort of tiptoed around the mud puddles. The water was over its banks. It was flood stage. It was a miracle of God. So, anyway, this is the story as it continues on down. And chapter 3, verse 17, the priest that bore the Ark of the Covenant stood on firm, dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And then chapter 4, when the nation was completely passed over, they came up. And the men who brought the 12 stones, they built a memorial, sort of an altar or a memorial pillar of these 12 stones a little ways away from the Jordan as a memorial to remind people of this miracle. Now we're told in chapter 4, verse 19, the people came up out of the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal on the east border of Jericho. Now the 10th day of the first month was significant because that was the day that Israel of old was to select out the land that was to be used for Passover. Now, chapter 5, verse 1, came to pass when all the kings of the Amorites that were beyond the Jordan westward, and all the kings of the Canaanites that were by the sea, heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan from before the children of Israel until they were passed over, that their heart melted, neither was there spirit in them any more because of the children of Israel. And at that time the Lord said unto Joshua, make you knives of flint, and circumcise again the children of Israel the second time. Joshua made knives, circumcised the children of Israel at Gibeath Ha-Aralah. And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise. All the people that came forth out of Egypt that were males, all the men of war died in the wilderness. All the people that came out were circumcised, but all the people that were born in the wilderness, by the way, as they came forth out of Egypt, had not been circumcised. So, Joshua now, we're told, circumcised them. They were uncircumcised. They had not been circumcised, by the way. Verse 8, came to pass when all the nation were circumcised, every one of them, that they abode in their place in the camp till they were whole. The Lord said unto Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off you. Wherefore the name of that place was called Gilgal, which meant circle, unto this day. The children of Israel encamped in Gilgal, and they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at evening in the plains of Jericho. Now, the second thing we notice, the first thing, God said, be strong and of good courage. Keep my commandments. The second thing that we notice as we come into this book that deals with conquest is that the children of Israel had to be circumcised. Now, God talked about, even in the book of Deuteronomy, about circumcision of the heart. And in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul talks quite a bit about the circumcision of the heart. And he equates that with the conversion process. That first we're told that we must have strength and courage. Then we're told that we must be converted. We must experience a circumcision of the heart if we are to go forward. They are circumcised and then they keep the Passover, because only those who were circumcised were entitled to eat of the Passover. So now they ate of the Passover and partook of the Passover on the 14th day, verse 10. And in verse 11, they did eat of the produce of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn, the self-same day. Obviously this year, the year of the entrance into the land, the first day of unleavened bread came on a Sunday, as it occasionally does. The Passover came on a weekly Sabbath. And because, in this case, the first holy day of unleavened bread was also the wave sheaf offering day. We know that because the day after the Passover, they ate unleavened cakes and parched corn. They ate of the produce of the land. Well, the law was that they could not eat of the produce of the land. God instructed them back in Leviticus 23. When you come into the land that I give you, you don't eat of the new produce until you have offered the omer, the wave sheaf, to God. Then you can begin to harvest the crop, and they were to count in 7 weeks to Pentecost. So they kept the Passover, and then the first holy day, which in that particular year was on a Sunday, so that the first holy day and the wave sheaf offering day were the same day, was such that they began to eat of the unleavened cake of the new grain right away. And then the manna ceased. Now, the next thing we find is we come on down that Joshua was by Jericho, verse 13. When he lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said, Are you for us or against us? And he said, No, I'm the captain of the host of the Lord, and I'm now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and bowed down and said unto him, What says my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Take off your shoes from your feet. The place where you stand is holy. Now this wasn't an angel Joshua was dealing with. You know, anytime in the Bible you ever read of one of God's servants being overwhelmed and falling down, bowing down before an angel, the angel immediately told him, Stand up. When Daniel fell down before the angel said, Stand up. Back in the book of Revelation, John saw this mighty angel and he fell down on his face. The angel said, Stand up. I'm a servant of God just like you are. This being wasn't an angel. When Joshua fell down on his face, this being didn't say, Stand up. He said, By the way, take your shoes off while you're down there. Because this is holy ground. You see, this was the God of Israel, the one that became Jesus Christ. You know, Joshua's out here and he sees somebody and he says, Who are you? You know, are you for us or against us? See, Joshua was reminded that he wasn't the captain of the Lord's host. He wasn't really the one in charge. God was. You and I, brethren, need to understand in our battle of overcoming, the captain of the Lord's host, the author and the finisher of our faith is Jesus Christ. We're not fighting a battle that we fight on our own strength. The captain of the Lord's host is there to lead us. Now, what did he lead him to do? Well, we find Jericho was quickly shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, none came in. And the Lord told Joshua, He said, I've given into your hand Jericho. Now here's what you do. You compass the city, all the men of war going about the city once. You shall do 7 days. And 7 priests shall bear 7 ram's horns before the ark. The 7th day compass the city 7 times, and the priests blow with the horns. Make a long blast with the ram's horn. When you hear the sound of the horn, all the people shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city will fall down flat. And the people shall go up every man straight before him. Now these 7 days were clearly, here in the context, the 7 days of unleavened bread. Jericho was symbolic of the whole Canaanite nation. It was the greatest city, the most powerful fortress. Joshua was told by the captain of the Lord's host, You've got to go out to battle. But you're not going to conquer by your own strength. I want you to go out and I want you to march around the city. 7 days I want you to march around the city. First 6 days, you make one big march. March around the city, priest blow the trumpet, go back. And on the 7th day, you go around the city 7 times. The priests blow the trumpet, and the people shout. And the walls become tumbling down. You see, God gave the victory. They had their part to do, but God provided. We are to be reminded. We have to have the strength and the courage to go forward in obedience to God. We have to submit ourselves to a circumcision of the heart, to the process of conversion. And we have to follow the captain of the Lord's host to go and to do what we need to do, to completely encircle the enemy, as it were. Now let's go a little further, because there are other lessons we're to learn. The children of Israel were told, in chapter 6, verse 18, "You shall in any wise keep yourself from the devoted thing," because all the things that were conquered or captured there in Jericho were devoted to God. "You shall keep yourselves from the devoted thing, lest you make yourselves accursed by taking of the devoted thing. So should you make the camp of Israel accursed and troubled." Now, what we're told is that the silver and the gold, the vessels of brass and iron are holy to the Lord, and they shall come into the treasury of the Lord. So, everything was carried out. But we find in chapter 7, verse 1, the children of Israel committed a trespass concerning the devoted thing, for Achan, the son of Carmi, of the tribe of Judah, took of the devoted thing, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against the children of Israel. Now here's the great citadel city of Jericho that falls. In the process of going in and disposing of Jericho, here is Achan, who sees some of the wealth of Jericho and he comes. He had been told, along with everyone else, everything here belongs to God. But Achan thought that he could keep some of it for himself and nobody would know. So he took it and hid it. Well, there was a little town, a little village just a short ways away from Jericho. And there were men that went up to spy out the village, and they returned to Joshua, and they said, "Look, this is a small little place. Let's just take 2,000 or 3,000 men and go up and spy it. We can take care of that. No problem." And so they went up there with about 3,000 men. Verse 4, "And they fled before the men of Ai. The men of Ai smote of them about 36, and chased them from before the gate, and smote them at the descent. And the hearts of the people melted and became as water." You can just see all the stars going down. Here they are. Boy, they're feeling pretty good. They conquered Jericho. All they did at Jericho was walk around the gate, was walk around the city walls. God conquered Jericho. They walked around, the priest blew the trumpet, they shouted, and the walls came down. They thought, that's pretty simple. I think we've got this one down pat. We'll just go over here and we'll take a couple of 3,000, we'll go over and we'll take care of Ai. It didn't work that way. The men of Ai came running out with swords. And they started hacking away at them, and a few of them fell. And the next thing you know, their heart just melted like water. All the stars went out, and they took tail and ran. Reminds me of my old dog. He was chasing cows one time. He got a whole bunch of them all cornered down where the fence came to a corner. If you ever seen something like that, you know the cows ran. Well, he loved it. He barked, and they ran until they all got down the corner, and then they all pivoted. It's almost like the military parade. They just made this pivot. And when they pivoted around and faced him, because now they were in the corner, all of a sudden he stopped. His tail had been high and he'd been barking and ferocious, and all of a sudden he stopped, they stopped, he stopped, and then they started walking toward him. Next thing you know, his tail tucked between his legs, he turned around and he took off running. And they were running. And they were chasing him, and I was in a deer stand about a quarter of a mile, and I looked, and here came my dog, and these cows were chasing in behind him. That dog climbed the ladder up into the deer stand. I've never seen a dog climb a ladder before, but he climbed the ladder. Now, he couldn't climb down. I had to get him down, and that's a totally different story. But he climbed up. And when I read about the Israelites and the hearts of the people melted and became as water, I think of my old dog Blackie, because his heart melted and became as water when there was resistance, you see. All the fire went out of these folks. Well, Joshua was just overwhelmed. He couldn't understand what had happened. And God told him in verse 11, chapter 7, He says, Israel has sinned. They have even transgressed my covenant that I commanded them. Up, sanctify the people. Say, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, there is a curse in the midst of you. You cannot stand before your enemies until you take away the accursed thing from among you. Sin pollutes the people of God. We cannot go forward to the victory that God has decreed for us with the accursed thing in our midst. You and I can't go forward individually holding on to sin in our lives. We can't go forward collectively as a church if there is the equivalent of this sort of situation. It has to be purged out. Now God identified what the problem was. Achan was cast lots. Achan was selected. And he admitted finally in verse 21 that he saw these things and he coveted them. And he took them and he hid them in the middle of his tent. Achan and his family members that were involved in this situation were taken out and stoned. It was a very hard lesson. You see, sin has a contaminating effect. God told Joshua in chapter 8, verse 1, Fear not, neither be dismayed. Take all the people of war with you and arise and go to Ai. So they did, and they were successful now, because the cursed thing had been removed from them. Now, as we come on forward, we find that in chapter 9, that the kings that were beyond the Jordan in the hill country, in the lowland, and along the shore of the Great Sea, the Mediterranean, when they heard about these things, they gathered themselves together to fight with Joshua and with Israel with one accord. The Gibeonites sought to make peace, which they did, and I won't go into that story. But anyway, we find in chapter 10 that Adonizedek, the king of Jerusalem, heard how Joshua had taken Ai and utterly destroyed it, as he had done to Jericho, and he heard how the Gibeonites had made peace. And he got all of the other Canaanite kings together in verse 4, and he said, Come unto me and help me, let us smite Gibeon, which made peace with Joshua. So Joshua went up, verse 7, from Gilgal, he and the people of war, all the mighty men of valor. He went up from Gilgal all through the night. This is in verse 9. And they came to pass, verse 11, as the Canaanites fled before Israel while they were at the descent of Beth-horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven, huge hailstones, and they died. And then Joshua, verse 12, spoke to the Eternal in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. He said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still upon Gibeon. Moon in the valley of Ajalon. The sun stood still and the moon stayed until the nation had avenged themselves of their enemies. The sun stayed in the midst of heaven and hasted not to go down about a whole day. There was no day like that before it or after it that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. Now, this is a fifth point. Notice, see, as we've gone through, Joshua was told, the starting point is you've got to have strength and courage to obey the law. You've got to be circumcised, remove the reproach of Egypt. Then, the captain of the Lord's host said, go forward and follow me. Circle the sea. God delivered. Then, the fourth thing we saw was that sin has a contaminating effect. Sin in the midst caused them to be defeated when physically they should have won. Here was little Ai. But sin brings God's curse. But now we notice a fifth point. Once sin had been removed, there was no miracle too great for God to work on behalf of His people. As we purge out the sin, as we surrender ourselves unconditionally to Him, there's nothing that's too great, too powerful, too impressive for God to do. Here was a tremendous miracle. People look and they say, well, I don't see how something like that could happen. How could the sun stand still, the moon stand still? Do you think it's a problem for the sun and the moon to stand still?
The God that made them stand still was the one who created them. He made the sun and the moon and the stars. He made everything. You think he had to sort of scratch his head and think about it a little while before he could figure out how to do that? People try to figure it out and say, well, I don't see how that could happen. God's the one that made everything. He designed the whole thing. He knew just exactly how to do it. He didn't need me and you to be able to figure it out in order to help him do it. He didn't have to eat an extra bowl of Wheaties that morning or anything. Just never paid. We're talking about the great Creator, the one who made everything. No problem to make the sun stand still. He demonstrates, you see, when you get rid of sin, and God is fighting for you, there's nothing that can stand in your way. You're told here in chapter 10, verse 25, Joshua said, "Fear not, nor be dismayed. Be strong and of good courage, for thus shall the Lord do to all your enemies against whom you fight." And so they went forward. It tells the story. In verse 43 of chapter 10, Joshua returned and the children of Israel with him to the camp of Gilgal. Well, it goes on through a little more of the battles and what occurred and how the city of Hazor was burned with fire. And then we find in the end of chapter 11, verse 23, "So Joshua took the whole land, according to all that the Lord spoke unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land had rest from war." Joshua gave them rest, didn't he? But it wasn't the permanent rest. Now, it's interesting. Let me show you when that occurred. If you just come on back a little bit, further in the book of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 14, "These are the inheritances which the children of Israel took in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun distributed to them by the lot of their inheritance, as the Lord commanded." Now notice, we come here, that verse 6, "The children of Judah drew near, and Caleb said to Joshua, You know the thing that the Lord spoke to Moses concerning me and you in Kadesh Barnea. 40 years old was I when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him back word as it was in my heart." Joshua and Caleb were the only ones who brought back a true report. "And Moses promised me," Caleb reminds Joshua here in verse 9, that I would be given this land. Verse 10, "Now behold, the Lord has kept me alive as he spoke these 45 years from the time the Lord spoke this word unto Moses. I'm as strong as the day I was when Moses sent me." Now, if you want to figure out how long the conquest took, this tells you. They went and spied out the land 1 year after they left Egypt. This event is 45 years after that. 45 years after they had spied out the land when Moses, see, those two gave a good report, the other 10 died, and those two gave a good report, and Caleb was promised that he would inherit. It's 45 years since that event. In other words, it's 46 years since the Exodus, because they had been a year out of Egypt before they came to spy out the land. Now they're 45 years after that. So they spent 40 years in the wilderness. Now they have spent 6 years subduing the land. Now it's interesting. What were they about to do? The land was being distributed, and they were going to enter into rest. Isn't that what was said? I'm going to give you rest. When did he give them rest? In the 7th year. It was the sabbatical year. That's when they inherited the land. They spent 6 years of conquest, 6 years subduing the land, and now after 6 years, they received the inheritance. They're entering into rest. The 7th year was the sabbatical year. So, here we find the pattern. We go right on through. They labored for 6 years, and the 7th year they finally entered into peace. Now, that of course is a pattern for us. Goes through the details of the boundaries. I won't go through that. Let's come on back a little further here in the book of Joshua. Goes through the boundaries of the tribal inheritances and the cities of refuge. And then we'll come on back to chapter 23. Came to pass after many days, when the Lord had given rest unto Israel from all their enemies round about. Joshua was old and well stricken, and he called for all of Israel, and they assembled. And verse 6, Joshua says, Therefore be you very courageous to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, that you turn not aside from the right hand, turn not aside therefore to the right hand or to the left, that you come not among these nations, these that remain among you, neither make mention of the name of their gods, nor cause to swear by them, neither serve them nor worship them, but cleave unto the Lord your God as you have done unto this day. Verse 12, If you do in any wise go back and cleave to the remnant of these nations, even these that remain among you, and make marriages with them, or go into them and they to you, the Lord will no more drive them out. They will be a snare and a trap and a scourge in your sight. Now, what we find here, this is the sixth point on which we want to focus. What we find here is there can be no compromise with the forces of evil. You can't compromise. If we're going to be conquerors, and the whole book of Joshua is about confidence, start out with strength and courage. Then we come to conversion, rolling away the reproach of Egypt, circumcision of the heart. Then we come to following the captain of the host of the Lord and going forward. Fourthly, we recognize that sin has a contaminating influence that will cut off God's blessing. Fifthly, we understand that once sin is purged out and turned from, there is no limit to what God can and will do in our behalf to help us. Here's a sixth point. We learn there can be no compromise with the world around us. We can't compromise because once we do and start watering down and blending in and being part and parcel of it, then it's like we get on a slippery slope and we lose our footing and away we go. Now, let's come on back in chapter 24. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem. He begins to rehearse the history. How your fathers dwelt of old beyond the river, beyond the Euphrates, verse 2. Terah, Abraham's father. How they served other gods. He tells them in verse 13, Now I've given you a land whereon you have not labored, and cities which you built not, and you dwell therein. Verse 14. Now therefore fear the Eternal and serve Him in sincerity and truth. And put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Serve the God of Israel, serve the true God in sincerity and truth. Now, it's interesting. That's the phrase Paul used back in 1 Corinthians 5 when he said we're not to partake of the leaven of malice and wickedness, but rather of the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So we come right back around full circle. We're to serve God in sincerity and truth, and that's what the unleavened bread is. Serving God in sincerity and truth. That's the seventh point, the conquest. That is something that is emphasized by this festival. This festival focuses in on our need to overcome, to triumph. We triumph by following Jesus Christ. By going forward in faith and courage, by yielding ourselves to conversion and circumcision of the hearts, by focusing on the captain of the Lord's host, the one who will lead us, the author and finisher of our faith, by recognizing the contaminating effect of sin, by recognizing that there's no limit to what God can do when we turn from sin and purge it out, by recognizing the importance of refusing compromise, and finally by focusing in on the fact of the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth that is to characterize our lives. Now let's conclude back here in the book of Romans chapter 8. We saw in verse 14 that as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they're the sons of God. God's Spirit leads us in the path of overcoming, triumphing over sin. You've not received, verse 15, the spirit of bondage again to fear. God's not leading us back into spiritual Egypt. You've received the spirit of sonship, and that's the word literally in the Greek, sonship. You become a son of God, whereby we cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God, and if children, then heirs. Heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ. If so be that we suffer with Him, that we may be also glorified together. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed in us. Whatever we have to go, and the obstacles and the difficulties and the problems we face, and the things we have to endure, none of it is worthy to be compared to the glory that shall be revealed. The earnest expectation of the creation waits for the manifestation of the sons of God. The creation was made subject to vanity, to being temporary, to passing away, not willingly, but by reason of Him who subjected the same in hope. The creation itself also shall be delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. All creation groans, labors in pain. Not only they, but ourselves also that have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the sonship, the redemption of our body. Coming on down here, we're told that in verse 31, what shall we say then to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? He that spared not His own Son, but delivered Him up for us all, how shall He not with Him also freely give us all things? Who shall lay anything to the charge of God's elect? It's God that justifies. Who's He that condemns? It's Christ that died, yes, rather that is risen again, who is even at the right hand of God, who also makes intercession for us. Who will separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or the sword, as it is written, for your sake we're killed all the day long. We're accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Knowing all these things, we are more than conquerors through Him that loved us. If we follow Him, we will conquer, because He is the conqueror. And through Him we are more than conquerors. I'm persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things present, nor things come, nor height, nor depth, nor any other creature shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Now in Him we are more than conquerors. We're here celebrating the conclusion of a festival that is a festival of victory. A festival that celebrates the victory of conquest. Joshua of old led in the conquest of a physical land, and a people entered into a physical rest. But that was temporary. The one of whom Joshua was a type, Jesus Christ our Savior, leads us in a conquest and overcoming of ourselves. Satan's influence of the world around us and of ourselves, our own nature. He leads us in that conquest, and through Him we are more